Take the children if you want, the old foreman said quietly, looking the imperial officer straight in the eye. But if you force good people to build your future, don't be surprised when they decide what that future looks like. The officer laughed. Every soldier around him laughed too. Years later, no one in the Vortak Empire would ever laugh at those words again. Red Mesa Colony sat nearly 80 million miles beyond the nearest civilized trade route, tucked into the rust-colored cliffs of Kestrel 9, where rich veins of titanium, iridium, and rare superconductive minerals stretched for miles beneath the frozen ground. It had never been a military outpost. It had never been a political symbol. It was simply a place where ordinary people came to work hard, earn honest paychecks, and send money home. Welders, mechanics, heavy equipment operators, electricians, teachers, nurses, families who believed that if they stayed away from trouble, trouble might forget where they lived. They were wrong. 3 enormous Vortak carriers descended through the gray morning clouds without firing a single shot. They did not need to. Their reputation arrived long before their ships did. Emergency sirens echoed across the colony as workers stepped away from drilling rigs and cargo haulers, staring into the sky with the same silent question written across every face. Jack Sullivan wiped grease from his hands with an old shop towel and watched the shadows pass over Assembly Building 3. 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with permanent lines around his eyes from decades spent squinting into welding arcs, he had seen enough bad days to recognize another one before anyone spoke a word. His younger co-worker, Ryan Brooks, hurried across the loading yard. "Jack, tell me those are inspectors." Jack never looked away from the sky. Inspectors don't bring battleships. Within minutes, Imperial landing craft settled onto the main freight platforms. Lines of armored officers marched through the colony with practiced confidence, reading names from digital manifests and attaching new identification tags to every building they passed. Nobody resisted. Nobody screamed. Parents quietly gathered their children closer, while supervisors instructed everyone to remain calm. The colony manager, Linda Carter, stepped forward carrying every ownership record and employment file she had. "We're a registered civilian operation," she said evenly. "Everything here is documented through interstellar trade agreements." The Vortak commander barely glanced at the files before handing them back. "This colony now belongs to the Empire." Linda hesitated. "There are over 4,000 civilians here." "Then congratulations," the commander replied. "You are now 4,000 Imperial laborers." The words landed harder than any explosion could have. Around Jack, conversations stopped. Men who had built refineries from empty rock lowered their eyes. Women who had crossed half the galaxy chasing better lives quietly squeezed each other's hands. Nobody wanted to become a hero. Most just wanted to make it home. Jack watched forklifts being repainted with Imperial markings before their engines had even cooled. Storage warehouses received new security locks. Communication towers switched frequencies under armed supervision. The colony changed ownership before lunchtime. Ryan leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "So, what do we do now?" Jack looked across the yard, where dozens of familiar faces waited for someone older to tell them everything would be okay. He wished he believed it himself. Instead, he picked up his worn toolbox from the concrete floor. "We go back to work." Ryan stared at him in disbelief. "That's it." Jack nodded once. "For today." The commander noticed the exchange and smirked. "Smart man," he called out. "Humans learn their place quickly." Jack met his eyes for only a second before walking toward the machine shop without another word. The officer saw surrender. The workers saw exhaustion. But hidden beneath the weight of that battered steel toolbox rested a folded notebook filled with years of engineering sketches, production layouts, load calculations, and ideas that had never fit inside any official blueprint. As the giant factory doors rolled shut behind him, Jack quietly ran one hand across the old milling machine waiting inside. It still belonged to the Empire now. The Empire simply did not understand that machines rarely cared who claimed ownership. They only obeyed the people who truly knew how to build them. Morning routines disappeared from Red Mesa Colony almost overnight. The coffee still brewed before sunrise. The machines still started at 6 o'clock sharp. The freight elevators still groaned beneath tons of raw ore. But every familiar sound now carried a different meaning. Imperial banners hung above every production floor, replacing company logos that had taken decades to earn. Human supervisors no longer gave assignments. They received them. Jack Sullivan stood beside milling line 4 with a maintenance scanner in one hand and a wrench in the other, while a Vorthack overseer watched from an elevated platform. The alien's translator crackled through the factory. Production efficiency has fallen by 3% since yesterday. Explain. Jack looked down at the machine instead of the officer. Your people changed the cooling sequence. The bearings are overheating. Then repair it. I already am. The overseer folded his arms. Humans require constant supervision. Jack simply tightened another bolt and restarted the conveyor. Within seconds, the warning lights disappeared. The machine settled into its steady rhythm. The overseer nodded with quiet satisfaction before moving toward another section of the factory. Ryan Brooks waited until the footsteps faded before whispering, "You could have let it burn itself out." Jack kept working. Then they would replace it. Exactly. Jack finally looked at him. With one that we do not know. Ryan frowned, trying to understand. Jack lowered his voice even further. Every machine we repair is one we understand. Every system we understand is one we can predict. Ryan did not answer. He simply nodded and returned to his station. Across the colony, the same pattern quietly repeated itself. Maria Alvarez in the electrical department accepted every request to recalibrate power grids. Former Navy electrician Daniel Foster volunteered to inspect communication relays. Emily Parker, once a high school science teacher before changing careers into industrial safety, accepted responsibility for inventory tracking after the Imperial clerks complained the paperwork was confusing. None of them argued. None of them resisted. The Vorthack commanders considered it proof that humans adapted quickly to authority. During lunch break, the workers gathered in the old machine maintenance room. The security cameras could see them eating sandwiches and drinking coffee, nothing more. Conversation stayed ordinary. "Coffee tastes terrible today," Ryan muttered. "It always did," Maria answered with a smile. Jack unfolded a paper maintenance schedule across the table. To anyone watching, it was nothing but production numbers. "Assembly line 7 needs inspection tomorrow," he said. Daniel looked at the chart for barely a second. "I can handle 7. Emily took a sip from her coffee. "Warehouse 3 is requesting additional storage racks." "Approved," Jack replied. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes before everyone quietly returned to work. The hidden meaning never appeared in their words. They had all spent enough years solving problems together to understand each other without explaining everything aloud. Late that afternoon, another Imperial officer entered the machine shop carrying a damaged mining drone. "Repair this immediately," he ordered. Jack removed the access panel and studied the damaged components. The drone was sturdier than anything humans had built before first contact, but it shared one familiar truth with every machine ever designed. Someone had assembled it. That meant someone else could improve it. "Can you fix it?" the officer asked impatiently. Jack gave a small shrug. "It will work better than before." The officer laughed. "That is why humans make excellent laborers. You build things. You do not ask questions." Jack quietly replaced 2 worn components with parts machined from leftover alloy sitting in the scrap bin. The drone powered on instantly, its movements smoother than before. The officer sounded almost impressed. "Very efficient." Jack handed the machine back, without changing his expression. Machines remember good craftsmanship. The officer walked away believing he had just witnessed another obedient worker doing his job. What he never noticed was that every improvement Jack made taught the humans something new about Imperial engineering, while every repair quietly made Imperial equipment just a little more familiar to the people who had begun memorizing every bolt, every circuit, and every weakness hidden beneath polished metal. By the end of the second week, the factory looked more efficient than it had ever been, at least according to the Imperial reports. Daily output climbed another 6%. Equipment failures became almost non-existent. Cargo trains departed exactly on schedule. Every report sent to the Vorthack command praised the discipline of the human workforce. Commander Kareth read the latest production summary with obvious satisfaction. "I was told humans were stubborn," he said as he walked through Assembly Hall 2 with 2 officers behind him. "Instead, they appear practical." One of the younger officers nodded. "Fear is an excellent motivator, Commander." Kareth glanced across the production floor where hundreds of workers moved with calm precision. "No, this is something else. They have accepted reality. Jack Sullivan overheard every word without lifting his head from the hydraulic press he was servicing. He quietly removed a damaged pressure valve, studied it for a moment, then replaced it with another that looked nearly identical. Ryan Brooks rolled a maintenance cart beside him. That one was still good, Ryan said under his breath. Good enough, Jack answered. This one gives us better control. Ryan looked confused. Control of what? Jack simply tightened the housing bolts. Someday you will know. Nothing Jack changed ever looked suspicious. Every replacement part matched factory specifications. Every repair passed Imperial inspection. Every adjustment improved efficiency exactly as expected. What nobody outside the human workforce realized was that the same tiny design philosophy appeared everywhere. Identical connector sizes, matching access panels, standardized wiring paths, components that could be removed with the same tools no matter which building they were installed in. Small conveniences for maintenance workers. Invisible advantages for anyone who understood systems. Across the colony, similar choices quietly accumulated. Maria Alvarez updated electrical routing diagrams after receiving official approval to simplify future maintenance. Daniel Foster suggested relocating backup power regulators to improve emergency response times. Emily Parker reorganized warehouse inventory so replacement parts could be found in half the time. Every recommendation reduced operating costs. Every recommendation received praise from Imperial auditors. During an afternoon inspection, Commander Kareth stopped beside an enormous automated assembly arm that had been malfunctioning for months before the occupation. Now it moved with smooth, almost graceful precision. Who repaired this? He asked. The overseer pointed toward Jack. Worker Sullivan. Kareth approached him. Your records say you were an industrial systems engineer before relocating here. Yes, sir. Your previous employers underestimated your value. Jack offered a polite smile. Most companies do until something breaks. Kareth actually laughed. A useful answer. He looked around the spotless production floor. You humans build remarkable machines when properly directed. Jack nodded without hesitation. Machines always reflect the people who maintain them. The commander accepted the compliment exactly as Jack intended. He walked away believing Imperial leadership had transformed an ordinary labor colony into a model industrial operation. That evening, after another 12-hour shift, the workers drifted toward the cafeteria carrying lunchboxes and coffee mugs like any exhausted crew finishing another day. Ryan sat beside Jack, rubbing sore shoulders. I still cannot see it, he admitted quietly. See what? Whatever you are building. Jack stirred powdered creamer into his coffee before answering. That is because I am not building one thing. Ryan frowned. Jack looked around the crowded room where welders joked about baseball scores, electricians debated barbecue recipes, and forklift drivers complained about aching knees. The cameras saw tired workers trying to forget another long day. Jack saw something very different. Every conversation strengthened trust. Every solved problem strengthened coordination. Every ordinary routine made tomorrow easier than today. People think construction starts with steel, Jack said softly. It does not. It starts when everyone solves the same problem without needing instructions. Ryan followed his gaze across the room. For the first time since the occupation began, he noticed how naturally everyone seemed to move around one another. Nobody waited to be told what to do anymore. They already knew. Jack finished his coffee and quietly folded another maintenance request into his notebook. On paper it authorized repairs to conveyor line 8. Hidden inside the measurements was another piece of a design that still existed only in the minds of ordinary workers who had long ago learned that the strongest structures were never built all at once. They were built one careful decision at a time. 3 months after the occupation began, Red Mesa Colony had become the highest producing industrial site in the entire Vorthak frontier. Cargo freighters arrived every other day, loading refined metals, reactor components, mining equipment, and construction materials that disappeared into Imperial supply chains stretching across dozens of star systems. Commander Kareth received another commendation from headquarters, congratulating him for transforming an ordinary civilian settlement into a model labor colony. He proudly displayed the message outside the administrative offices where every worker could see it. Ryan Brooks stopped long enough to read the announcement before quietly shaking his head. He actually believes he did this. Jack Sullivan adjusted the straps on his tool bag. People usually believe the story that makes them look smart. Ryan smiled for the first time in weeks. That almost sounded like a joke. Do not get used to it. Inside Machine Shop 4, the workday unfolded exactly as it always did. Welding torches sparked across steel frames. Conveyor belts carried fresh castings from one station to another. Forklifts rolled through marked lanes while maintenance crews responded to service calls with quiet efficiency. Nothing looked unusual because nothing was supposed to. The colony had become so predictable that even the Imperial security patrols shortened their inspection routes. They stopped checking every workstation. They stopped questioning maintenance requests. They stopped paying attention to conversations that sounded painfully ordinary. "Did you finish those blueprints?" Emily Parker asked while organizing storage bins. Daniel Foster barely looked up from an electrical panel. "Not yet. I will finish them after dinner." A nearby Imperial guard heard the exchange and continued walking without a second thought. To him, they were discussing paperwork. Jack heard something completely different. Sector 7 had completed another phase ahead of schedule. Later that afternoon, Maria Alvarez approached Jack while carrying a clipboard filled with power consumption reports. "Warehouse 3 needs another inspection," she said. Jack scanned the page for only a moment before signing it. "Schedule it for Thursday morning." Perfect. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. To anyone listening, it was routine maintenance planning. Hidden inside those simple words was confirmation that another section of the colony's electrical backbone had quietly shifted onto a standardized control network designed entirely by human engineers. Every ordinary conversation carried 2 meanings now. One for the Empire, one for the people keeping track. Even the children living in the residential district sensed the strange rhythm settling over the colony. They noticed that adults spoke more softly than before. They noticed neighbors borrowing tools they already owned. They noticed evening cookouts where nobody discussed work directly, yet everyone somehow left knowing exactly what tomorrow required. One Saturday afternoon, little Emma Carter sat beside Jack while he repaired an old bicycle outside the apartment complex. "Mr. Sullivan," she asked, "why do all the grown-ups keep smiling at each other without saying anything?" Jack tightened the front wheel before answering. "Because sometimes people who trust each other do not need many words." Emma thought about that for a moment. "Is that a secret?" Jack smiled gently. "No, it is something you earn." Across the colony, Commander Kareth reviewed another monthly efficiency report with obvious satisfaction. "Worker morale appears stable," one officer observed. "No sabotage, no organized resistance, no escape attempts." Kareth nodded confidently. "Humans value comfort. Give them predictable routines and enough work to occupy their minds, and they become dependable." None of the officers questioned his conclusion because the numbers seemed to prove it. They never realized those same predictable routines had become the foundation of something much larger. Every maintenance crew now understood every production line. Every electrician could navigate every power corridor. Every warehouse supervisor knew exactly where every shipment entered and left the colony. No single person possessed the entire picture, yet together they understood the colony better than anyone who claimed to own it. That evening, Jack opened the worn notebook hidden beneath the false bottom of his toolbox. He added one more hand-drawn line to a growing network of sketches before quietly closing the cover again. The drawing still looked incomplete, almost meaningless to anyone else. But with every passing day, scattered pieces from hundreds of ordinary decisions were beginning to fit together so naturally that even Jack found himself wondering if the Empire had unknowingly become the most generous construction partner humanity had ever been given. 6 months after the Empire arrived, Red Mesa no longer resembled the struggling frontier colony Jack Sullivan remembered. Production had nearly doubled. New assembly bays stretched across the northern plateau. Additional rail lines connected the mines to expanded foundries. Massive fabrication towers worked around the clock under bright white floodlights that turned night into a permanent afternoon. Headquarters celebrated the achievement by assigning a senior Imperial auditor to evaluate the operation. His name was Inspector Varesh, a quiet official whose career had been built on finding inefficiency where others saw success. Unlike Commander Kareth, Varesh trusted numbers more than compliments. The morning he arrived, he spent 3 hours reviewing shipping manifests before asking his first question. Why has raw material consumption increased by 14% while finished inventory remains within expected limits. Kareth answered confidently. We expanded production capacity. Varesh tapped the report with one long finger. Expanded production usually creates surplus inventory. The workers have become exceptionally efficient. That explains labor output. It does not explain material flow. The question lingered in the room longer than anyone liked. Later that afternoon, Varesh walked through the fabrication complex with Jack serving as his assigned maintenance guide. They stopped beside a massive automated forge where glowing alloy flowed through enclosed channels before disappearing beneath reinforced flooring. This facility was modified, Varesh observed. Jack nodded. Several times. Authorized. Every modification carries an approval number. Jack handed him a digital maintenance log. Every document matched Imperial regulations perfectly. Every signature was genuine. Varesh continued reading as they moved deeper into the plant. You replaced hundreds of individual machine controllers with standardized modules. Makes repairs faster. And cheaper. That was the goal. Varesh looked around the enormous workshop. Interesting. He could not find a single violation, yet something continued bothering him. Everything was becoming simpler. More connected. More interchangeable. Human engineers always requested parts that fit multiple systems instead of just one. Maintenance tunnels linked buildings that had once operated independently. Electrical substations shared identical layouts. Every improvement appeared logical by itself. Together they hinted at a design he could almost recognize but could not quite define. Meanwhile, life across the colony continued with quiet normalcy. Emily Parker requested additional shelving for Warehouse 3 because replacement components no longer fit the old storage arrangement. Daniel Foster asked permission to reroute another power conduit to reduce maintenance time. Maria Alvarez recommended replacing dozens of unique software interfaces with one common operating standard. Every request saved money. Every request received immediate approval. Commander Kareth proudly signed each authorization without reading more than the summary page. These humans are making my career, he joked during an officer's dinner. Perhaps every colony should be managed this way. Varesh remained unusually quiet. That evening he returned alone to the central factory after official inspections had ended. Standing on an elevated observation platform nearly 80 feet above the production floor, he watched hundreds of workers finishing another shift. Forklifts moved with almost choreographed precision. Electric carts crossed intersections without hesitation. Welders passed equipment to mechanics before anyone asked. Nobody appeared rushed, yet nothing slowed down. It looked less like a factory and more like a single living organism whose parts instinctively understood one another. Jack noticed the inspector watching from above, but never acknowledged him. Instead, he quietly handed Ryan Brooks another maintenance request. Ryan glanced at the paperwork. Another conveyor upgrade? Jack smiled faintly. That is what the form says. Ryan folded the paper into his pocket without another question. From the observation deck, Varesh watched the exchange through binocular optics. 2 workers. 1 sheet of paper. Nothing suspicious. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he suddenly realized he had spent the entire day inspecting machines while completely overlooking the people who operated them. And somewhere deep beneath the factory floor, hidden behind perfectly legitimate construction permits and thousands of ordinary maintenance decisions, the first outline of a design far larger than any single building was quietly beginning to take shape. The first sign that something had changed was so ordinary that almost nobody paid attention to it. At exactly 8:17 on a Tuesday morning, an automated cargo shuttle stopped outside Warehouse 3, waited for 12 seconds, then quietly restarted its route without receiving a single manual command. The delay barely registered on the operations log. One Imperial technician blamed a sensor glitch and cleared the notification before finishing his coffee. By lunchtime, everyone had forgotten it happened. Everyone except Inspector Varesh. He requested the diagnostic file that afternoon. The shuttle lost communication with central routing, one technician explained. It switched to local control for a few seconds. Varesh looked up. Why would a transport vehicle have local control? The technician shrugged. The human maintenance crews recommended the update several months ago. They said it would reduce downtime if communications ever failed. Did it? Apparently. Varesh closed the report without another word, but the question stayed with him. Everywhere he looked, The colony seemed to recover from small problems faster than any industrial facility he had ever inspected. Conveyor belts restarted before repair teams arrived. Backup generators synchronized almost instantly during routine maintenance. Elevators rerouted themselves around service interruptions without waiting for central authorization. None of it violated Imperial engineering standards. In fact, every improvement increased reliability. Still, something about it felt less like independent systems and more like one enormous machine teaching itself how to keep moving. Down in Machine Shop 4, Jack Sullivan listened while Ryan Brooks described the morning delay. "Did you hear about the cargo shuttle?" Ryan asked quietly while replacing hydraulic seals. "Everyone is talking about it." Jack tightened another fitting without looking up. "Machines make mistakes." Ryan smiled. That one did not feel like a mistake. Jack finally glanced toward him. "No, it felt like practice." Ryan held his breath for a second before returning to work. Across the room, Maria Alvarez entered carrying another stack of electrical maintenance requests. "Power Station 2 needs another inspection," she announced casually. Emily Parker answered from the inventory desk. "Already scheduled after shift change." Daniel Foster added without lifting his eyes from a wiring diagram. "I will meet you there." The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds. The Imperial supervisor monitoring the floor never reacted. He had heard conversations exactly like that hundreds of times before. Routine had become camouflage. That evening, Commander Kareth hosted another dinner for visiting officers inside the administration building. Glasses clinked. Music played softly through ceiling speakers. Kareth proudly pointed toward the brightly lit factories outside the windows. "Look at them," he said with satisfaction. "Not one strike. Not one organized protest. They have accepted their place." Several officers nodded in agreement, but Varesh continued staring through the glass. Hundreds of workers crossed the yard as shifts changed. Nobody appeared rushed. Nobody appeared frightened. They simply moved with quiet purpose. "What are you looking at?" Kareth asked. Varesh answered slowly. "Have you ever noticed that they rarely wait for instructions anymore?" Kareth laughed. "That is called experience." "Perhaps." Varesh remained unconvinced. Meanwhile, beneath the central fabrication plant, Jack unlocked a maintenance corridor that officially no longer existed on any current blueprint. Ryan followed him carrying nothing more suspicious than a flashlight and a toolbox. The narrow passage connected power conduits, coolant lines, communication trunks, and structural supports that had gradually been standardized over months of perfectly legal renovations. Ryan stopped halfway through the tunnel and looked around in amazement. "I have worked here for 7 years," he whispered. "I never realized all of this connected." Jack rested one hand against the steel wall. It did not. Ryan turned toward him. "You mean?" Jack nodded once. "We connected it." For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Above them, the factory continued producing record amounts of material for the Empire. Below them, hidden behind approved maintenance projects and ordinary engineering decisions, the colony had quietly become something no Imperial architect had ever intended. It was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was beginning to think, respond, and adapt as one unified system. And somewhere deep inside that growing network, the very first heartbeat of a much larger creation had quietly begun. The arrival of Grand Admiral Zarek changed the mood across Red Mesa before anyone even saw his flagship. Cargo traffic stopped for almost 2 hours while Imperial escorts secured every landing platform. Inspection drones filled the skies. Officers who normally barked orders suddenly stood perfectly straight whenever a communication screen lit up. Even Commander Kareth looked nervous. "Everything must be flawless," he reminded his staff. "The Admiral is here because headquarters wants to see the Empire's most productive colony." Inspector Varesh remained unusually quiet. He had submitted 3 reports recommending a deeper engineering review, but none had received a response. Headquarters cared about production numbers. Red Mesa had broken every record in the sector. That was all anyone wanted to hear. Grand Admiral Zarek stepped onto the colony wearing a simple dark uniform without medals or ceremonial armor. He was older than Jack expected, with calm eyes that seemed to notice details others ignored. Instead of visiting the administrative offices first, he walked directly toward the main fabrication complex. "Show me what built these numbers," he said. Commander Kareth smiled proudly. "With pleasure." Jack Sullivan watched the inspection party approach while adjusting a robotic assembly arm. Ryan Brooks leaned closer. Think he will notice? Jack kept tightening bolts. He already has. Zarek moved slowly through the factory, stopping every few yards to examine machinery instead of reports. He watched conveyor systems feeding materials between buildings without interruption. He noticed identical maintenance ports appearing on equipment manufactured by different companies. He paused beside a wall-sized engineering diagram before asking, "Who standardized these layouts?" Kareth answered immediately. "Our labor teams implemented several efficiency improvements after the occupation." "Labor teams," Zarek repeated. "Who designed them?" Kareth gestured toward Jack. Worker Sullivan supervised many of the modifications. Zarek walked over. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, the Admiral asked, "How long have you been an engineer?" 23 years. Military background? No, sir. Jack answered honestly. Industrial systems. Manufacturing. Infrastructure. Zarek nodded slowly. Infrastructure decides who wins long before soldiers arrive. Jack simply replied, "That has been true for a very long time." The answer lingered between them. Unlike the other officers, Zarek did not mistake calm for surrender. He looked around the immense factory once more, studying the movement of workers instead of machines. Everywhere he turned, people solved problems before supervisors noticed them. Electricians anticipated mechanics. Warehouse clerks anticipated shipping crews. Maintenance teams arrived before equipment actually failed. It was almost impossible to tell who was leading because nobody appeared to give orders. They simply understood one another. As the inspection continued, Zarek unexpectedly left the designated tour route. Ignoring Commander Kareth's protests, he followed an overhead maintenance bridge connecting 4 separate production buildings. From above, the colony revealed something hidden at ground level. Conveyor systems, power lines, coolant pipes, communication trunks, and transport rails no longer followed the original construction plans. They curved together in repeating geometric patterns that stretched across the entire industrial district. Individually, they looked harmless. Together, they resembled the internal framework of something much larger. Zarek stopped walking. "These were not built independently," he said quietly. Varesh looked up from his tablet. "That is exactly what I have been trying to explain." Kareth frowned. "It is only standardized engineering." "No," Zarek answered without taking his eyes off the structures below. "Standardization serves a purpose." Silence settled over the bridge. Far below, Jack noticed the Admiral standing perfectly still. Ryan followed his gaze. "Is something wrong?" Jack watched for another moment before answering. "No." Ryan looked confused. Jack closed his toolbox with a soft click. "Something has finally been seen." At that same moment, Zarek quietly spoke words that nobody else on the bridge fully understood. "This is not a factory anymore." No alarms sounded. No emergency messages appeared. The machines continued running exactly as they had every day for months. Yet for the first time since the occupation began, someone from the Empire had looked past the production numbers and realized that every improvement, every repair, every approved renovation, and every ordinary maintenance request had never been separate projects at all. They had always been pieces of one design waiting for someone patient enough to recognize its shape. Grand Admiral Zarek did not leave the colony the next morning as everyone expected. Instead, he canceled his departure, sealed the official inspection schedule, and requested access to every engineering record created since the occupation began. Commander Kareth interpreted the decision as a routine audit. Inspector Varesh knew better. He watched Zarek spend hours comparing old construction blueprints with the current infrastructure, laying transparent overlays across digital displays until dozens of tiny alterations merged into one unmistakable pattern. Finally, the Admiral leaned back and asked a question that froze the room. Who approved allowing every subsystem to communicate with every other subsystem? Kareth answered without hesitation. "We did. It reduced maintenance costs." "No," Zarek replied calmly. "You approved the requests. Someone else designed the destination." Across the factory floor, life continued as if nothing had changed. Jack Sullivan replaced worn drive belts. Ryan Brooks calibrated loading cranes. Maria Alvarez inspected another electrical relay. Emily Parker checked inventory counts, while Daniel Foster signed maintenance reports. Every movement looked familiar because every movement had been rehearsed by ordinary work itself. Around noon, an Imperial communications tower briefly lost synchronization with the central command network. Before the operators could react, 3 nearby substations automatically redistributed power, 2 conveyor lines adjusted their speed, cargo traffic rerouted around the interruption, and the tower restored itself in less than 15 seconds. No emergency order had been issued. No supervisor had approved the response. The colony had quietly solved its own problem. Commander Kareth smiled proudly. Remarkable efficiency. Zarek did not smile. Remarkable independence. Silence filled the control room. Varesh slowly looked toward the panoramic windows overlooking the industrial district. It is responding like a living system, he murmured. Zarek nodded once. Exactly. That afternoon he requested a private meeting with Jack inside the main fabrication hall. The 2 men stood between enormous assembly machines humming with steady rhythm while workers continued their shifts around them. Zarek rested one hand on a steel support beam. Tell me something, Mr. Sullivan. If I remove one machine from this building, production continues. Yes, sir. If I remove an entire production line, the others compensate. If I disconnect one power station, Jack answered without hesitation. Another station carries the load. Zarek studied him carefully. You answered too quickly. Jack met his eyes with the same calm expression he had carried since the first day of the occupation. Engineers spend their lives asking what happens when something fails. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Zarek quietly asked, "What have you actually built here?" Jack looked across the factory where welders, electricians, mechanics, teachers turned inventory clerks, and former miners all continued working without drawing attention to themselves. A community that knows how to keep working, he answered. It was the truth. It simply was not the whole truth. That evening, Zarek climbed the highest observation tower on the colony. From nearly 300 feet above the ground, the entire industrial district spread beneath him like a carefully drawn circuit board. Rail lines linked fabrication plants. Cooling systems crossed beneath processing centers. Automated mining drones flowed through synchronized routes. Every warehouse, generator, workshop, and transport hub now depended on every other one. It no longer resembled an occupation camp. It resembled the internal architecture of something waiting to awaken. Ryan quietly joined Jack outside the machine shop as the last shift ended. He knows, does not he? Jack watched the lights slowly brighten across the colony as night operations began. He knows enough to ask the right questions. Is that dangerous? Jack considered the question before answering. Only if he believes he still has time. At that exact moment, deep beneath the central fabrication complex, thousands of standardized controllers exchanged another routine series of maintenance signals. To every Imperial monitoring station, the transmissions looked perfectly ordinary. To the engineers who had spent months designing them one small improvement at a time, they meant something entirely different. For the first time since the Empire claimed the colony, every major system was finally connected. The structure hidden inside Red Mesa was no longer incomplete. It was simply waiting for the moment someone forced it to reveal what it had quietly become. The following morning, no alarms echoed across Red Mesa. No emergency orders appeared on the factory monitors. The assembly line started on schedule. Freight trains rolled out exactly on time. Welders sparked arcs of blue light across steel frames, while forklifts carried another day's worth of materials toward the loading docks. Anyone arriving from orbit would have seen exactly what the Empire expected to see. Another productive colony, serving Imperial expansion without complaint. Grand Admiral Zarek stood alone inside the central control tower, watching thousands of workers begin another shift. Commander Kareth stepped beside him with obvious confidence. You see? Whatever concerned you yesterday has disappeared. Zarek never looked away from the window. No, it was never hidden. We simply failed to understand what we were looking at. He pointed toward the sprawling industrial district below. You believed you conquered a workforce. You actually assembled a civilization. At that same moment, Jack Sullivan walked through the main fabrication hall, carrying the same worn toolbox he had carried since the first day of the occupation. Ryan Brooks caught up beside him. What happens now? Jack smiled faintly. Now we keep building. Even after all of this. Especially after all of this. Ryan looked around the enormous factory. I used to think this place was only about machines. Jack rested one hand against a steel support column polished smooth by years of work. Machines are easy. People are the hard part. They continued walking through the factory, while workers greeted one another with quiet nods that no longer carried hidden meanings. They no longer needed secret conversations because everyone already understood the same lesson. Trust had become part of the infrastructure. Responsibility had become habit. Ordinary people had transformed an occupied colony simply by refusing to stop caring about the quality of their work or the people standing beside them. Later that afternoon, Grand Admiral Zarek prepared his final report for Imperial headquarters. Commander Kareth glanced at the first page before asking, "Will you recommend additional security?" Zarek slowly closed the document. No amount of security would change what has already happened. Then more soldiers? Soldiers cannot solve engineering. More oversight. Zarek finally looked directly at him. Oversight fails when it mistakes obedience for surrender. Kareth had no answer. Before departing, Zarek requested one final conversation with Jack. They met outside the factory just as the evening sun painted the cliffs of Kestrel 9 in deep shades of copper and gold. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Zarek asked, "Tell me honestly, did you ever intend to build a weapon?" Jack looked toward the colony where children rode bicycles between apartment buildings. Teachers helped students with homework. Mechanics laughed outside the machine shop, and families gathered for dinner after another long day. "No," he answered quietly. "We intended to build a future." Zarek studied the peaceful scene before him. "Then why does it feel so powerful?" Jack folded his hands over the handle of his old toolbox. "Because people who learn to depend on each other become stronger than anything you can manufacture." The Admiral slowly nodded. For the first time in many years, he understood the difference between owning something and truly controlling it. Ships could be captured. Buildings could be occupied. Equipment could be claimed with official declarations and military banners. But knowledge, trust, experience, and purpose could never be taken the same way. Those belonged only to the people willing to carry them forward together. As the Imperial shuttle lifted into the evening sky, Red Mesa continued exactly as it always had. The machines kept running. The lights stayed on. Another freight train departed on schedule. Nothing dramatic marked the end of the story because the greatest victories rarely announce themselves with noise. They reveal themselves years later, when people realize that quiet determination outlasts fear, careful craftsmanship outlasts force, and communities built on trust can accomplish what empires built on power never truly understand. Long after the ships disappeared beyond the clouds, Jack remained outside the factory, watching another shift begin. He adjusted the strap on his old toolbox, smiled to himself, and walked back inside, because the strongest things humanity ever builds are never the machines. They are the people standing beside them, choosing every single day to build something worth leaving behind.